At 2 p.m., with the ship's bell ringing 4 times, 2 bells for each hour, and with fresh breezes and cloudy skies, Cook put the Endeavour to sea. Banks began making notes and observations, his lucubrations, in flowery, expressive handwriting in a plain-leaved, leather-bound quarto journal. He noted that he and Solander were in excellent health and spirits, perfectly prepared to undergo the cheerfulness, any fatigues or dangers that may occur in our intended voyage. Sailing on a long ocean voyage could be more dangerous than going to war, and everybody on the ship knew that some of them would die. But there was also eager expectation in the wind that the Endeavour would reach lands no European had seen. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the history of fresh produce. And that is once again a passage from Kiza's incredible book called Banks. And we are back, Patrick, with part 2 of our special latest series on Joseph Banks. And last time, when we launched the series last week, we left Joseph Banks standing on the edge of something vast, a young, absurdly wealthy gentleman bursting with curiosity about to pour his fortune and his future into a single audacious idea that plants mattered. And that understanding the natural world, cataloging it and naming it might quietly reshape empires. And this week, the adventure truly begins. The ropes are cast off, the sails go up, and HMS Endeavour, I was going to say ships, but really slips out of Plymouth Sound, not just as a naval vessel, but as a floating laboratory. And this is really the moment when botany leaves the garden and heads for the open ocean.
And not just any ocean, right?
No.
This is science done at sea and cramped cabins among sailors, livestock, and frankly, heroic quantity of wine.
Exactly. This is discovery under sail, right? So you got seasickness, scurvy, bruised egos, and very quickly vineyards, as you pointed out, because the Endeavour's first stop would be Madeira. And Madeira would give Banks his first taste of what this voyage was really going to mean.
All right. So let's do it right and get into it, okay? So the Endeavour sails from Plymouth on a Saturday, the 26th of August, 1768, and not quite on schedule, John, because
of course it wasn't.
There's never, right? It's not like today's cruise ships, right? Where they break it, they're going off, it's all on time, because there's a late summer storm that delays their departure. But once they are clear of the channel and conditions settle, right? But unfortunately for Joseph Banks, his stomach does not.
Oh, well, it's always reassuring to know that even the great heroes of science spent the opening days leaning over the rail, right?
Yeah.
Adds a little humanity to it.
It does. I mean, it really does. So Banks is completely incapacitated by seasickness for several days. He can barely function, but once he recovers, he throws himself into work with extraordinary energy, right? He and Daniel Solander, his Swedish collaborator, right, that we met in the last episode, trained by Linus himself, are soon on deck every day, okay? And guess what they're doing, John? They're recording everything they see. Fish, birds, porpoises, floating seaweed, anything that can be caught, sketched, pressed, bottled, or even just described, right? So it's worth pausing on this because this voyage is very different, right? Like naturalists had gone to sea before, but never like this. Never with this level of like official backing to say, right?
No, I mean, this is basically the state saying, science matters. This is important to us.
Exactly. And the British government, is sponsoring Cook, but Banks is bankrolling science, right? Itself, his own staff, his own artists, servants, and equipment. So in doing so, he's quietly setting a precedent that large-scale exploration and natural history deserve serious investment. So below decks, conditions are cramped but tolerable for now, okay? Banks enjoys the shipboard cheerfulness even if the Endeavor is packed with sailors, Marines, servants, animals, and his equipment, right? As Kiza writes in his book, there's barely room to swing any of the ship's cats, and yet Banks thrives socially.
Well, that's just a strange analogy, Patrick. Swinging cats. I mean, was that something 18th century sailors did for entertainment? Anyway, go on.
Yeah, I don't have an
Just
answer
run.
for you on that. It's got to mean something completely
Swinging
different
cats.
than what we think. But swinging cats aside, okay, Banks makes friends easily. Cook, meanwhile, runs a tight ship, no nonsense, but he's fair. Okay, and that makes him popular with the crew.
Yeah, and the contrast between the two men couldn't be sharper. I mean, these are people from totally different sides of life, really.
Right. I mean, not on paper, no, right? Banks is a child of privilege, opera going, idle in the technical sense, never forced to earn a living. His wealth comes from vast estates, right? 200 tenant farms in Lincolnshire alone, right? And mining interests in Derbyshire. Lot going on. Cook, on the other hand, by contrast, is nearing 40, a family man, the son of a Yorkshire farm laborer who has clawed his way up through the Royal Navy. So he's left behind a pregnant wife and three small children. And yet, this is crucial because they recognize something in each other, a shared seriousness, a willingness to go to the ends of the earth in the name of knowledge. And as a result, mutual respect forms quickly. Okay. So by the 8th of September, the Endeavour passes Cape St. Vincent off southern Portugal. Now, Banks notes on this that he has now bid adieu to Europe for some time. And a few days later, land appears again, lush, cultivated, and green.
And that, of course, is Madeira.
That's right. And on the 13th of September, the Endeavour enters off Funkel after covering around 2,200 kilometers in just 18 days. They reach an island that Banks finds immediately striking. The hillsides are, he writes, entirely covered with vineyards almost as high as the eye can distinguish. This is not wilderness. This is agriculture as landscape. As for Cook, he follows his instructions precisely, right? Madeira is a vital resupply stop. He stocks the ship with extraordinary quantity of wine, 14,000 liters to be exact,
Just a little bit.
water, fruit, vegetables, sweets, fresh beef, right? Even a live young bull weighing over 600 pounds is brought aboard, okay? So
Nice.
we're
All right.
just supplying is a must. But for Banks and Solander, there is something else entirely. The first real test. What is that test? They are the first ashore, heading straight to the British consul to introduce themselves. Within hours, they have accommodations, horses, and guides. For 5 nights, Banks escapes the cramped ship and lives in comfort, a small luxury that allows him to work at a
Yeah.
full pace.
And they really put that work in. I mean, they're excited to be there, but they're also really excited to actually get to work.
Relentlessly, I would say, right? Despite it being the worst time of the year, right, for vegetation, they collect hundreds of specimens, plants, insects, fish. By the end of their stay, Solander will report to Linus that 50 or 60 of the plants they gathered are entirely new to Western science. This is the moment where Banks' methods come into their own, collecting in the field, then recording, describing, and drawing specimens back aboard the ship in the great cabin, right? This becomes the temple for scientific exploration going forward. But Banks is not just admiring Madeira, he's also judging it, okay? He praises the natural abundance, walnuts, chestnuts, apples, growing almost spontaneously. And yet, he is scathing about what he sees as view. The island cries out to bet for better cultivation: corn, bananas, guavas, pineapples, mangoes, and cinnamon.
This is where basically Banks, the biologist, starts sliding into Banks, the imperial improver. Right? He's not shy to voice his opinions on things.
Exactly. And he can't see the land without imagining how it might be more productive, more profitable by European hands and European knowledge, right? And even the wine industry, Madeira's great export earns his scorn. He watches men crushing grapes with their bare feet and elbows and sneers that Noah must have had a more advanced system before the flood, right? Everything is carried on men's heads, There's no carriages, there's no roads, right? Or if they are, they're so intolerable bad, it's hard to get across. And then there's the famous episode of the Portuguese governor, Senor Pereira. Banks is furious at losing a day of collecting to polite social obligations until Pierre asks to see an electrical machine aboard the Endeavour. Banks happily obliges, right? He straps the governor to the device and shocks him, in Banks' words, as much as he chose.
Yeah, science has revenge.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so. And meanwhile, Cook is observing over something far more serious, scurvy. He has set it kill, right? He's seen it kill men in horrifying numbers. 26 men, to be precise, on the previous voyage alone when he called HMS Pembroke across the Atlantic to fight the French in Canada. He had people dying on the way. He is determined, though, it will not claim his crew, and specifically this crew. So he loads the ship with fresh produce, onions, 20 pounds per man, vegetables, fruit. And we've talked about this before in earlier episodes that oranges and lemons were commonly fed to British sailors, but citrus fruits were not always available on these long voyages. So Cook turned to fermented cabbage, what he called sauerkraut. And clever as he is, Cook knew this wasn't the most agreeable tasting dish, so he first serves it as an exotic delicacy at the officers' table so sailors will copy their superiors.
Clever.
Cook, that's great. Cook also insists on a strict meal times, right? Very strict. And when discipline slips, Cook is ruthless. 2 men are flogged while in Madeira, 12 lashes each for missing their fresh beef ration.
That's pretty harsh punishment for missing dinner. Can you imagine doing that in your household?
Well, guess why?
Yeah,
You can't have someone pass away on this trip, right?
yeah, that's true.
They got to stick.
For your own good. It's for your
Go
own
back.
good.
What about go back to the NASA episode? Remember that? Like
That's true. Yeah, they have very regimented meal.
very regimented schedules, and then but they also did say sometimes that they'd come back with more food because the astronauts were working, right? So it makes sense. But here, science travels on discipline, right? On the night of the 18th of September, the Endeavour sails from Madeira. Ahead of them lies the Atlantic and then Brazil. The next landfall is more than a month away. During this stretch of the voyage, though, on the 25th of October at 8 a.m., the ship crosses the equator, and the traditional sailors' ceremony follows. Those, right, who had not been over the equator before are subject to fines paid in rum, wine, and brandy, or being dunked 3 times into the ocean for the ship's yard arm, right?
Well, what would you do? What would you pick in this case? Would you pay the fine and alcoholic beverage, or would you be dunked from the boat into the ocean?
Or do you live if you're dunked from the boat, or is it just you just get dunked 3 times?
Yeah, they strap you in. You're okay. You're just gonna be dunked 3 times to the ocean.
Yeah. If I had the wine or brandy and I had extra, I would do that. If I didn't have enough, I'd get dunked, right? So, just saying. So, what did Cooks and Banks do? And Solander, what they do? They pay up.
Well, yeah.
Bank pays for his servants. Even the dogs and the cats are charged.
Oof.
Okay. Others, about 20 or 30 of them, choose the water rather than give up their drink rations. And Bank watches closely, fascinated by the expressions of terror, pride, and drunken joy. By the time they cross fully into the southern hemisphere, the Endeavour is no longer just leaving Europe behind. It is sailing toward a very different world, and one where Banks' assumptions are about to be seriously tested, John.
Oh, yeah. That's probably putting it mildly, because as it turns out, Brazil was going to be a very different experience than their first
Way
landing
different.
in Madeira. So let's move along this timeline now. So now it's the 6th of November, 1768. Cook is closing in on the eastern coast of Brazil, and he makes a perfectly reasonable calculation, and that's to dock in Rio de Janeiro. Because after all, Rio was a major imperial port at this time. It was friendly on paper, well supplied with fresh fruit, livestock, water, all these essentials. Precisely the sort of place you stop if you're crossing the Atlantic with a ship full of sailors and in this case, also a gentleman botanist who's desperate for plants. And so by the evening of the 12th of November, Joseph Banks got his first glimpse of it. Sugarloaf Mountain rising out of the haze, a beach which he thought of the whitest sand imaginable. Basically, this tropical abundance everywhere he looked.
Yeah, and it must have felt like Madeira turned up to 11.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that's what makes what happens next so jarring because instead of open arms, Banks and Cook run straight into suspicion, deep, entrenched bureaucratic suspicion. And the man in charge here in Rio, the Viceroy of Brazil, Dom Antonio Orolim de Moura Tavares, the Count of Azambuja, simply refuses to believe them. Now, the idea that the King of England would send a ship halfway around the world just to observe the transit of Venus, I mean, it just sounds like nonsense to him. So he ends up suspecting that the Endeavour must be up to something far more sinister, something like smuggling or spying or illegal trade.
There's a wonderful line right later where the viceroy asks Cook whether the transit of Venus is the North Star moving to the South Pole.
Yeah, that's right. And Banks nearly laughs himself inside out, as you can imagine, because he actually notes rather cuttingly that this alone, quote, sufficiently shows the state of learning in this place. So he's definitely thinking very lowly at this point of these kind of the viceroy, let alone else in Brazil. And it tells you really two things at once. First, the gulf in scientific understanding here, and second, that Banks is already incandescent with rage because for 3 weeks, right? 3 weeks, the Endeavour sits at anchor in shallow water off the Isle of Cabras and Guanabara Bay. The shoreline is just, it's right there, teeming with plants and animals Banks and Soller have never seen before. And they're not allowed to set foot on the land.
And it's like being locked outside a sweatshop with your nose pressed to the glass, everyone.
Yeah. No, that's exactly what it's like. And Banks does not take it well. So Sidney Parkinson, so we met him in the last episode. He's one of the artists on the voyage employed by Banks. He says that his boss was much chagrined, which is probably the understatement of the century because Banks curses, he swears, he raves, he stamps his buckled shoes up and down the deck. I mean, he's elbowing his way to Cook's desk now and attacks the paper with his quill, firing off furious letters to the authorities. And he writes, "They only laugh at me." And then, he's calling the Portuguese officials rascally, illiterate, unhumanized, barbarous even. So he's angry.
Diplomacy, Joseph Banks style.
Yeah, he's not having any of it. Now, on the other side of this, the other key actor on the Endeavour, Cook, the captain, meanwhile, is trying to keep this whole expedition from becoming an international incident. And it actually gets worse. So after visiting the viceroy, Cook discovers an officer has been assigned to shadow him everywhere he goes. And when the crew protest at having these guards placed in their boats while collecting supplies, they end up getting beaten by the Portuguese soldiers and thrown into what Cook calls a loathsome dungeon, chained alongside enslaved black prisoners. And Banks at this point is just horrified and obviously also deeply offended. I mean, he tells Cook the viceroy has no idea who he's dealing with, which, yeah, you kind of expect from a man of his standing to say. And then he decides to play his trump card. And Banks writes again, declaring rather magnificently that disagreeable as it is to state his own rank, he must do so because he's a gentleman, a man of fortune, and he has personally paid for the scientific arm of this expedition. All he wants, he insists, is to leave to go ashore with the proper people to collect trees, shrubs, plants, birds, beasts, fishes, insects, the works.
And you're so right. And the same answer though is still no.
Yeah, a flat no. And Banks, gentleman of fortune or not, is basically to stay right where he is under the orders of this viceroy. So he ends up sitting there, fuming, staring across the water at a city of extraordinary wealth and brutality. And while he sits there, though, trapped, he learns about Rio, and he learns that Rio is enormous. So there's tens of thousands of white inhabitants and vastly more enslaved Africans, about 17 enslaved Africans to each white inhabitant. So quite a lot. He also learns that Rio's wealth comes from gold mines deep inland, reached by secret roads patrolled by soldiers where anyone who can't explain themselves is hanged on the spot. And so you have 40,000 enslaved people imported annually. Lives are consumed at an appalling rate. Banks is many things, but he's not blind to what he's seeing in Brazil, or specifically Rio. And all the while, the Portuguese remain convinced that the Endeavour is a Trojan horse. And so you have one officer on the Endeavour, Lieutenant Gore, who reports that Banks and Solander are suspected by the Portuguese of being supercargoes and engineers, essentially trading spies, not naturalists.
Of course, right? I mean, and then right, almost immediately, right? What happens, right? Um, I, we go into. Isn't it funny that as we look at this, John, it reminds you of more stories that we've seen along the way. But the lieutenant also has something else to say, though, doesn't he?
He does. He suggests quite calmly that since they now know the harbor well enough, perhaps some discreet excursion might be arranged. So on the 22nd of November, Banks sends a servant ashore at dawn who stays out all day and returns with plants and insects. 2 days later, more servants go, including the shy but mischievous Parkinson, the artist. And then Solander slips off in disguise, posing as the ship's surgeon. And then finally, on the night of the 26th, Banks himself goes. And this is one of the great images of the voyage. This large, broad, framed, fashionably dressed Joseph Banks squeezing his body through the cabin window at midnight, lowering himself by rope onto a boat, and drifting away on the tide until he's out of earshot of the sentinels.
Botany by burglary.
That's right. And he rows to an unfrequented stretch of shore and stops into what he later describes as a wonderland. And the countryside is just bursting with life, passion flowers, mimosa, clutia, small garden plots full of cabbages and peas and beans, pumpkins, watermelons, pineapples. He even notes that the yams and cassava are grown for starch because European corn won't thrive there. And don't think he's not tasting things, because he does. And he ends up tasting the melons, which he notes are delicious. The pineapples, however, disappoint him. Apparently, they're not as good as those he's eaten back in Europe. But above all, he's just exultant. This is a place where few European naturalists have ever seen, and he knows it, and he's drinking it all in.
And as it should be, right? But then almost immediately, it all snaps shut again, right?
Yeah, the very next day, Banks hears the viceroy is sending armed search parties now to hunt down suspected Endeavour breakaways. And so, as you can imagine, that's the end of these midnight adventures. And Banks and Solander retreat to the great cabin and wait this whole thing out. And finally, on the 2nd of December, Banks writes, "Thank God," as the Endeavour prepares to leave. And Cook has navigated this diplomatic minefield without lasting damage, though not without drama, of course. So a guard boat follows the Endeavour out, and as they pass the fort at Santa Cruz, 2 shots are fired across the Endeavour's bow, one just barely clearing the mast. And Banks, again, is just aghast that the Portuguese would have the gumption to start firing at them as they leave. But the Portuguese would later claim that it was all a bureaucratic mistake. Whoops, fired off a cannon in your direction.
And that's what we have to deal with, right? I mean, a bureaucratic mistake, a remarkably on brand ending, right?
Yeah, very much so. And so with that, the Endeavour turns south once more. The tropics fall away and the air begins to change, and ahead lies a very different landscape entirely. It's colder, harsher, and far less forgiving.
Hmm. I mean, let's be real. You're right. And because this next leg of the voyage is not about pleasant islands, this is preparation for one of the most feared passages on Earth, Cape Horn, the gateway of the Pacific. And Cook, with one eye on the clock and another on the charts, right, want to get around the Horn and into the Pacific and efficiently as possible, right? So Banks, meanwhile, wants to stop constantly, everywhere. Cook has to resist repeatedly. Banks, increasingly enthusiastic, requests to make landfall just a little collecting. Come on, just a little bit.
It reminds me of my sisters when we were on car trips as kids, and they just kept asking to use the restroom. Like, can we stop here? Can we go here? Can we stop here?
It's
That's
always
Banks.
listen, it's always something.
Yeah.
It's always something. But by mid-January 1769, after nearly 5 weeks grinding south through the Atlantic, the Endeavour anchors in sheltered bay near the very tip of South America, Tierra del Fuego, the land of fire. And in the early light of dawn, Banks sees it for the first time. An archipelago cut by narrow clefts and deep chasms, dark rock and cold seas, and a landscape that looks at a distance strangely inviting, though.
Inviting, which should always be a warning sign with Banks. You don't want him. You don't want him saying that. Ooh, that looks strangely inviting.
Exactly. Because this is not Madeira. This is not Rio. This is a world of violent tides, sudden snow, and weather that can turn murderous in minutes. So it takes Cook 3 attempts over 3 miserable days to negotiate Le Mer Strait. The tides fight them, the wind turns foul, and the cold southern ocean rolls in long, heavy swells. Eventually, they anchor in a sheltered bay, Port Maurice, and the moment the anchor bites, Banks and Daniel Solander are ready. Cook, to his credit, indulges them. He even provides an officer and a boat. In his journal, he notes with just a hint of dry understatement that Banks and his party were very serious of being on shore. This is putting it mildly. Banks and Solander spend about 4 hours foraging near the coast. And even if the brief window, right, this brief little window, the payoff could be extraordinary. And it is. They collect around 100 plant specimens. Banks is ecstatic. He later writes that every single one was new, entirely different from anything either of them had seen before. This is a key moment for Banks as a botanist. Tierra del Fuego isn't useful in an obvious agricultural sense. This isn't breadfruit or citrus or sugar, but it's proof for something bigger. Life adapts everywhere, even here, even at the edge of the habitable world, John.
Yeah, it's like a laboratory for extremity, right?
Oh my God. Exactly. Plants push to their absolute limits, and Banks wants more, right?
Yes.
A few days later, with Cook still, waiting for the currents to ease, Banks decides these conditions are perfect for an inland expedition. He writes, and this is one of those wonderfully misleading passages, that the weather was vastly fine, like a sunshiny day in May. No heat, no cold, no insects. Ideal. And so he does what Banks always does. He escalates.
That's right. He wants height, right? He wants to see the interior. He wants to go deeper. He wants
Yeah, what's going on here?
he wants the alpine plants, the species shaped by the cold and the wind and the altitude.
Yeah.
And this time he brings almost everyone. So Solander, of course, his trusted friend, Herman Sporing, Solander's assistant. You got Charles Green, the astronomer, who's obviously there for the transit of Venus. William Monkhouse, the surgeon. Alexander Buchan, another artist. 4 servants, 2 seamen. And then, of course, you got the equipment, the bags, and the guns, and the paper, and the presses. And his greyhounds trot along, too. So quite the party. But what looks from the shore like this open tundra turns out to actually be something far worse. Basically, a sodden bog tangled with dense, waist-high trees. So progress is slow and exhausting. The ground gives way underfoot. The vegetation is fighting them every step of the way. And then about 2/3 of the way in, the first warning sign. Alexander Buchan, already weakened from illness earlier in the voyage, collapses in an epileptic fit. So they have to stop. They light a fire for him and they tend to him. And eventually he seems to slowly recover. But Banks makes a decision here that tells you a lot about him. He presses on.
I mean, this is the moment where you want anyone to say, Joseph, maybe we've done enough today, buddy.
Yeah, you would think that, right? He's like, I
Jeez.
think this guy could use a rest, but no. Banks is not
Break
that kind
time.
of guy.
Yeah.
He says we're going to continue. So Buchan and some of the party end up getting left behind to keep an eye on, obviously, Mr. Buchan. And so Banks, Solander, Green, and Monkhouse continue uphill. And it's there as they climb higher that Tierra del Fuego shows its true character, because now the temperature drops suddenly. The sun vanishes behind thick cloud and snow begins to fall. Not gently. Okay, this is not some like beautiful little gentle winter wonderland, but this is sharp, driving bursts of snow. And the wind cuts through their clothes. And what had been this sunshiny day in May, Patrick, which you just described a few seconds ago, becomes something altogether different. Because at this point, Green and Monkhouse make their trek back to join the others downhill. They've had enough at this point. And so the rest of the party continues, but it gets even colder. And Solander is the first one to speak up and announces he can't go any further. And so he actually just drops to the ground laying on the snow. And then one of Banks' servants, Thomas Richmond, also says he can't continue. The other servant, George Darleton, hasn't given up just yet, but he's definitely struggling. And so Banks tries to keep Solander and Richmond moving because, the last thing you want to do in that cold weather is not move. But Richmond collapses, seemingly coming to terms that he will just die where he lies. And Darleton insists that he will stay with his fellow servant. And so Banks leaves a sailor and his greyhounds with his servants while he sends for help. Now, with the help of another sailor, Banks carries Solander down back to the fire that had been lit for Buchan. And once everyone is warmed up again, Banks sends 2 men back out into the weather to collect the servants and sailor that were left behind. But, Patrick, they can't find them now. And to avoid falling asleep and freezing to death, Banks and the others by the fire are walking around the fire all night long. And then at midnight, Banks hears shouting. And with 4 other men, they go out and find the sailor who had been with the 2 servants. So they bring the sailor now by the fire, and then they go back into the snow to find the others. And he finds Richmond standing up, but not able to walk. He almost looks like a statue, just kind of an eerie statue, just standing there, frozen, while Darleton is still laying on the ground. And the wind is just too strong to light a fire. So Banks orders a crude shelter built from branches that he can find in the area. And he ends up leaving his greyhounds with the 2 men, hoping this greyhound's body heat might help these 2 guys survive the night. But unfortunately, it doesn't, because by morning, Richmond and Darleton are dead, frozen solid. And when the party returns, the dog is still alive, and he actually is reluctant to leave the bodies. And this is really the first tragedy of the voyage. So you have 2 men dead, not from battle or shipwreck or any other kind of engagement that you would expect a death to result from in a long voyage like this, but comes purely from overconfidence, misjudgment on Banks's part, and just the sheer indifference of the environment. And naturally, Banks is shaken. But he doesn't stop. He continues collecting, though now he, of course, is going to stay closer to the shore. He's not going to be completely reckless. And as he's collecting, his boxes are filling with specimens. Parkinson and Buchan, once they've recovered, are drawing plants and conditions that are often barely workable. And Banks mourns the dead, yes, but he also writes with striking candor that their keeping boxes are full of new plants.
It's a brutal reminder of the cost of this kind of science. Seriously.
Yeah. I mean, enlightenment knowledge paid for in human lives, essentially. But eventually the wind turns in Cook's favor. The Endeavour weighs anchor and pushes south into the Southern Ocean. And by the end of January, they're at 60 degrees latitude, unknowingly just a few hundred kilometers north of Antarctica itself. Cook sets a course into the vast, largely unmapped Pacific, 7,000 kilometers to Tahiti, which is their destination, a third of the globe, no reliable charts, no help if something goes wrong. And yet, ahead of them lies something very different from Tierra del Fuego. Warmth.
I was going to say, of course.
Warmth, abundance, fertility, an island that will become central not just to the voyage, but to Banks's vision of plans, empire, and possibility.
Well, John, you've got me excited for what's next. When we come back, the Endeavour arrives in Tahiti and everything changes. We'll be right back.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the history of fresh produce. So, Patrick, we left the Endeavour sailing away from the rough water off the tip of South America and heading to the warm Pacific Islands, much better destination. And by mid April 1769, after a long, strangely anticlimactic crossing of the Pacific, the Endeavour finally sees Tahiti rising out of the sea. And this is the place everyone on board thought they knew already. The island of abundance, of beauty, of free love and easy food. But when Joseph Banks first glimpsed it on the 11th of April, the hilltops were still wrapped in cloud. So he couldn't yet see the paradise he'd been promised. And what he felt instead was simpler and very human, just relief at being alive, at being healthy, and really at last being on the brink of going ashore after months of, salted meat and hard biscuits.
And probably with some fairly vivid expectations as well, given what the
Yeah.
previous visitors had written home, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the men of the Dolphin had not been subtle. So this is another journey that had taken place to Tahiti previous. And their accounts had circulated through London like contraband pornography. I mean, tales of an island large, fertile, extremely populous, where women arrived in canoes and quite unashamedly made themselves available.
Hmm.
And sailors, it was actually said, would happily live on half rations for the chance of a girl apiece. Nails were pulled from the ship itself to pay for pleasure because iron was in very high demand by the Tahitians. This to them was the only thing they wanted. So as the Endeavour entered what is now Matave Bay, then Port Royal Bay, on the 13th of April, and mind you, this is 7 weeks ahead of schedule, which is incredible. The scene was almost theatrical. So you have turquoise lagoons, black sand beaches, palms glowing green against the volcanic interior. Tahitian men circle the ship in canoes, showing cheerfulness and curiosity and very clear about what they wanted. And that, again, is iron.
Right. And which, of course, the British had in abundance,
Mhm.
and the Tahitians absolutely did not.
No, exactly. Iron was transformative.
Yeah.
A single nail could outvalue almost anything else. Now, Cook, mindful of what had gone wrong here 2 years ago, when Wallace had ended up firing cannon into a crowd of canoes, moved fast to set the rules. So friendship was to be cultivated, quote, by every fair means. Iron and cloth, sorry, were not to be squandered. Trade was to be orderly and for provisions only. So you can see what he's getting at here. Because again, previously sailors were trading things for pleasure. But he's making it very clear. We are only trading for provisions. And for Banks, those provisions were a revelation. So coconuts, breadfruit, roasted and raw, small fish, apples. And after 3 months at sea, he found them quite simply, as he put it, very acceptable.
Yep.
And so Banks and Cook go ashore and are met by hundreds of islanders, faces open, curious, unmistakably welcoming. Plantain branches are carried as symbols of peace. They walk inlands past groves of coconut palms and breadfruit trees into a landscape no European botanist had ever studied closely. And this, Banks knew, was why he had come. But then, shortly after arriving, the joy soured.
Yeah. I mean, listen, this is this is the death of Buchanan, right?
Yeah, that's right. So we have another.
Buchanan's dying. Okay.
Yeah, so you have Alexander Buchan, which is again Banks' landscape artist, the man who was really meant to turn Tahiti into images for polite London drawing rooms, but he's collapsed. He suffered seizures before. Again, before break, we heard this back in the freezing chaos of Tierra del Fuego. But here in the heat of the tropics, he convulses again. And you have Dr. Monkhouse, who's working on him, but there's nothing he could do. And so Buchanan dies early in the day of 17th of April. And Banks is just devastated. Not just personally, though he clearly liked Buchanan, but professionally because Banks again is thinking about himself and his plant mission. His quote, airy dreams, as he put it, of dazzling England with scenes of the South Seas vanished overnight. And he wrote even further. He goes a month longer, and what an advantage it would have been. So you get a little bit of a flavor of Banks's, concerns. He's talking about if only this guy lived a month longer, it would have been much better for me. But of course, that doesn't happen. Banks passes, and he ends up getting buried at sea, which Banks had insisted on because a gentleman he felt should not be left ashore in a strange land. So there's that.
Yeah, and with that, the burden of recording Tahiti really falls on to Parkinson. Seriously.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. So Parkinson has suddenly worked to exhaustion because remember, Parkinson was meant to be the landscape artist. Sorry, Buchan was landscape artist. Parkinson was more of the plant and animal artist. So now plants, fish, birds, anything that could be preserved had to be drawn. And so Tahiti becomes, in a sense, a race against time and mortalities, especially for Parkinson. But art drawing and projects aside, this is also unmistakably a sexual education. And Banks threw himself into Tahitian society with extraordinary enthusiasm. He wrote far more about love than Linnaeus would have ever expected. Tahiti, Banks concluded, was a place where, quote, love is the chief occupation, the favorite, nay, almost the sole luxury of the inhabitants. And so what he observed here was that the houses had no walls, privacy was non existent, women gestured towards mats on the floor, affection was shown by pressing noses together and breathing each other in. And Banks Never Shy attempted to actually introduce European kissing. So he was, in his own mind, both scientist and missionary, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, can you be both? I think you can, but it's a remarkable mixture, okay? Botany, anthropology, and what we might politely call participation.
Participation is
A
playing
little bit
violin
of
here, right?
participation, okay?
Because one moment Banks is admiring what he calls a Tahitian rose, and the next there's an uproar because Solander's pockets have been picked. So a snuff box is gone, an opera glass has vanished, and Banks just leaps up, bangs the butt of his musket, and watches just the entire company scatter in terror, including the pretty girl he had been admiring moments before. Now, the items are eventually returned, but again, this love and larceny in Tahiti are never far apart during this whole experience.
Mm.
Now, through it all, Cook's real priority looms in the background, which is, again, the Trance of Venus. This is the whole reason why they're really here. So trees are felled. A fortified observatory, which comes to be known as Fort Venus, is built, guarded by cannon. And the scientific heart of the voyage is essentially being prepared here. Meanwhile, Banks begins doing something quietly revolutionary. So on the 4th of July, near Point Venus, he plants seeds. So watermelons, oranges, lemons, limes, seeds that were brought from Rio de Janeiro. So he's given seeds away to the Tahitians as well. And this is Banks not just observing global botany, which is for the most part what he's doing, but now he's intervening in it. He's moving plants across oceans, experimenting for the first time with botanical imperialism.
Wow. Listen, and yet the actual plant, right? That plant haul from Tahiti is, I would say, modest.
Yeah, surprisingly so, because just over 300 species are collected, which is not much more than Madeira and in far more time. So that all said, though, Banks is deeply impressed by what the Tahitians themselves have achieved, especially breadfruit, a staple crop, carefully cultivated,
Mhm.
sustaining an entire society.
Oh, yeah.
Tahitian agriculture, he realizes, is sophisticated, deliberate, and highly effective. And he writes endlessly about property, or I would say maybe the the lack of European style property, because in Tahiti things are shared, borrowed, taken, and this difference again causes constant friction between the Endeavour crew and the indigenous people of Tahiti. Theft just dominates the journals. And the most dangerous moment actually comes when the astronomical quadrant, which is absolutely vital for observing Venus, disappears. And Cook reacts brutally. I mean, again, he's the leader. And if he can't fulfill the whole reason why they traveled thousands of kilometers to reach here, that's a problem. So he ends up seizing canoes. The bay that they're anchored in is effectively blockaded. And Banks, armed with pistols, runs for miles through the jungle in pursuit of the instrument, accompanied by a very highly agitated Mr. Green, which is our astronomer for the voyage. That all said, with all this drama, luckily, without any bloodshed or violence, the quadrant is eventually returned.
Wow. And now, not all the Tahitians, right, were troublemakers, right? In fact, there was one Tahitian in particular that Banks got on well with, right?
That's right. So Tapea is his name, and this gentleman. So he was a priest, a navigator, a political operator, one could say. And Tapea knows the stars as a map, so he can name 70 islands and tell you how to sail to them. So islands like Samoa, Tonga, Fiji, the Cook Islands. He understands winds, reefs, currents, an entire oceanic system invisible to Europeans. Now, of course, Banks is entranced by all this. I mean, this is right up his alley. This is essentially knowledge no herbarium can capture. Now, finally, the day arrives that they've all come to this island for, which is the transit of Venus. And that project goes on as expected. Venus is observed. They take all their measurements and calculations and all the stuff they came here to do. So scientifically, it's a success. Socially, however, it is chaos because while officers are peering through the telescopes, the sailors descend into something close to hysteria. It's kind of like your parents walk away and you're just like, all right, free for all. Let's get doing crazy stuff. So the sailors end up stealing nails, taking temporary wives, and earning floggings when they get caught. So basically doing everything they were not supposed to. And so by July, the islands is just tired of them and they have it. And as Cook looks to bring their stay in Tahiti to a close, he opens an envelope he'd been carrying since leaving from England. And this is kind of like one of these do not open until letters. So now that the transit of Venus has been completed, he opens this next secret mission, the Admiralty sealed orders, and he reads the orders. And now comes the real gamble, Patrick, because now the next task Cooks is given is the search of the great southern continent, Terra Australis Incognita, or what we now know today as Antarctica. So the Endeavor's crew packs up. Tapea begs to come with them. He argues that his life is in danger at home. Cook, of course, hesitates. He's thinking to himself, London's never going to care about a Tahitian priest, and he's responsible for bringing this guy. I mean, he really doesn't want anything to do with that. But then you have Banks, who comes in, and he believes that Tapea and his servant boy, Tayata, would actually be quite valuable to the voyage. And so he tells Cook that he'll cover all necessary expenses for Tapea and his servant. And he actually ends up joking, if English gentlemen can keep lines, why not Tahitians? Which is not, very appropriate today, but that was kind of the logic back then. And so on the morning of the 13th of July, after 3 months on the island of Tahiti, the Endeavour sails. And Banks, now with Tapea by his side, climbs the masthead of the Endeavour, waves to the canoes until the island fades from view, and neither realizing that they will never return again to Tahiti.
And actually, John, having Tapea on board turned out to be one of the quite, I would say, master strokes of the expedition.
Yeah.
Because as the Endeavour pushed south and west through the Pacific, Tapea could translate Polynesian languages that would otherwise have been utterly impenetrable to the Europeans, right?
Yeah.
So it looks like Banks' gamble, like it really paid off.
Yeah,
and then on the afternoon of the 6th of October, 1769, after nearly 3 months at sea, hearts began to hammer aboard the Endeavour. Up in the rigging, a 12-year-old servant boy named Nicholas Young saw something rise out of the haze, and he yells out, "Land ho!" For Cook, this was the moment of reckoning, right? Was this finally the edge of the great southern continent, Terra Australis Incognita, that geographers had dreamed about for centuries, right? There was only one way to find out. Cook did what he always did. He followed the coast. For
Mhm.
almost 6 months, the Endeavour threaded its way around what we now know as New Zealand,
Mm.
cautiously probing bays, tracing headlines, mapping what no European had properly mapped before. And by the end of March 1770, Cook reached a decisive conclusion. This was not a continent at all, it was two large islands. Banks recorded the moment with a kind of like refuel poetry. The realization he wrote brought about the total demolition of our aerial fabric called continent. The great southern land, at least here, simply vanished.
Yeah, such a Banks line. Half scientific clarity, half wounded romantic disappointment.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. And while Cook was dismantling continents, Banks and Solander were doing what they could, botanizing whenever the weather would or in circumstances allowed them to. Right. This was no Tahiti. Landings were few. Conditions were harsh, and encounters with the Maori were unpredictable. So sometimes curious, sometimes friendly, sometimes violently hostile. Okay, they were the first Europeans that Maori had seen since Abel Tasman's brief and disastrous visit in 1642. And yet, despite all this tension, the botanical results were astonishing. Every plant they collected was new to European science. Entire ecosystems were being encountered for the first time. But the season was turning. Cook decided it was too dangerous to return east via Cape Horn. Instead, he would sail west, aiming eventually for Batavia. And on 1st of April 1770, the Endeavour left New Zealand behind and pointed her bow toward the eastern coast of a place Europeans called New Holland, right? And Banks agreed with Cook's logic, but not without regret. Abandoning the hunt for the southern continent pained him deeply. He confessed that he still firmly believed such a land existed. Antarctica, he was convinced, was out there somewhere, just not today.
Not today. No. And this is really the pivot point, is it? Because the dream of finding that southern continent dies, but now Australia begins.
It does, 100%. And after nearly 3 weeks at sea, early on the morning of the 19th of April, land is sighted again. Banks is ecstatic. He writes in his journal that the country rose in gently sloping hills, right? Clothed with trees of no mean size and with appearance of the highest fertility. This was the first European site of Australia's eastern coast. Cook names the southernmost point Point Hicks after the man who spotted it. Though history would probably misspell his name for the next 2 centuries, Cook also realizes something else. Okay, John, this land lay far north of where Tasman had charted Van Diemen's Land, which meant correctly that Tasmania was an island, and this was something entirely different. So for days, they sailed north along a coast that seems endless. Cook has no idea that thousands of kilometers lay ahead of him. Okay. Then on the 28th of April, they find a bay that looks promising, sheltered, calm, full of life. At first, Cook calls it Stingray Bay after the huge rays that crew caught out and happily ate. But once Banks and Solander set foot ashore, the name no longer seems adequate. Okay. They are suddenly overwhelmed. There's plants everywhere, marsh plants, scrub plants, towering eucalyptus forests that are inland. Banks and Solander collect a frantic pace, right? They're just going and going and going. And this ship's, I would say, herbarium is now bursting. Banks genuinely fears that his haul will rot before it can be dried and pressed. Sidney Parkinson, the overworked artist, sketches furiously, barely able to keep up, often recording colors and notes because there simply isn't time to paint them properly. Some specimens are dried, others are wrapped in damp cloth and sealed in metal lined chests to keep them alive just a little bit longer.
Yeah, this is one of the greatest botanical gold rushes in history, and it's really happening in real time. As you
Absolutely.
described.
Absolutely. And in 8 days, they collected more plants here than anywhere else on the voyage.
Yeah.
Entire genre entered European science at once. Acacias, Leptocermins, the Crimson's bottle brush, and 4 species that would eventually bear Banks' own name, Banksia. And Cook notices too, the bay is no longer about stingrays, what they ate when they first got there. It's about botany. And so he renames it Botany Bay. The
Mm.
southern headline was named Point Solander, right? Headland. The northern cape was Cape Banks. The landscape itself was being rewritten into botanical honor. Their encounters with local Aboriginal people, the Guigal, are tense and tragic. Misunderstandings escalate into violence, warning shots, musket fire, shouted words no one understood. Even Tupez Polynesian words don't work here, right? Banks observes everything with the eye of a scientist, even as spears fly. The moment echoes far beyond that beach. And yet, amid all of this work, the work continues. Cook finds fresh water. Banks examines strange gum oozing trees, eucalyptus, comparing their resin to ancient dyes used for millennia, right? Nature presses on, indifferent to human fear. And then on the 6th of May, 1770, the Endeavour weighs anchor and heads north again. Cook charts headlands, names bays, sails past what he calls Port Jackson without entering it, unknowingly passing one of the finest harbors on earth. Day after day, Banks continues collecting whenever an opportunity arises, John. Even when coconuts turn out to be cabbage trees, he still returns the ship 14 or 15 new plants in a single afternoon. But as June approaches, the coastline becomes far more dangerous. Reefs multiply, channels narrow, and the water shifts color beneath the hull. Cook has taken the Endeavour where no European had gone before. Now he was sailing blind through a maze of coral and shoals.
Yeah. And this is where exploration stops being romantic, right? And starts becoming lethal.
100%. And guess what? When we go, well, when they go and what lies ahead of the Great Barrier Reef, right? If I thought I was there with them, John, like I was ready to go, right? It's vast, it's uncharted, and it's utterly unforgiving, right? So this is where we're going to leave the Endeavour today, creeping northward, unaware that in the darkness ahead waits the single greatest crisis of their entire voyage.
Yes. Quite the cliffhanger. Something lethal lying ahead. Lots of
Until next
tension.
time.
That's right. So, of course, if you are a member of the History of Fresh Produce Club, you can find out right now what the next challenge for the Endeavour will be. Otherwise,
Gotta wait
we'll
till
just
the
have
following
to-
week.
we'll have to wait until next week. You'll have to take a nap on board, rest a little bit, and sit there panicking as to what is going to be coming your way.
Correct.
So until next time, it's goodbye for me, John Papp.
And me, Patrick Kelly.